happened very quickly, and I'm consenting to the recording here, that we are living in an age of AI, and that this has happened very quickly, that these technologies have become widespread. So just in the last decade, we have the widespread emergence of autonomous vehicles. We see them on the road. We have intelligent assistants of various kinds in our pockets. We have entire institutes of higher learning that are devoted to AI, like the AI Now Institute at New York University. And I ask if this is a descriptive name or a normative name. Is it AI Now or is it AI Now? But there's also a lot of concern about these technologies around the impacts of automation on labor, discrimination, which is going to be a major focus of this talk. At the far end, fear that the robots are going to kill us, that lethal autonomous weapons systems are going to be unleashed. And all of this has sort of led to widespread concern in the human rights community about the impacts of AI. And I think pessimism about these technologies, which is in kind of keeping with the current pessimistic moment. So I'm going to do three things in my talk. I'm going to try to keep it pretty quick so we have time for questions and discussions. I'm going to quickly talk to you about what I'll give you a definition of AI. There's a million definitions, but this is one that I think helps to unpack the legal and human rights consequences, how we view the human rights of impacts of AI in the present day, based on the methodology of our report, and then the question, what should businesses do about it? So I'll address those in turn. Okay, and there's four kinds of takeaways. In case we get disconnected or there's any other problems, this is the this is the meat of the presentation. The first is that AI is already having a paradoxical effects on the full range of human rights protected by international domestic law. So we're talking about civil rights, political rights, economic, social, cultural rights. By paradoxical, I mean that AI is improving rights outcomes for some rights for some people, harming other rights for other people, and it's kind of, for a particular right, there could be different effects on different people. Yet, I'm an optimist. I think there's enormous potential in these technologies to improve rights outcomes. But to do so, we're going to need two things. We do need the private sector to really embrace its responsibility to respect human rights, and for governments to enact appropriate regulatory guardrails. Okay, so what is AI? And please feel free to, if you have a question, use the raise hand function. Soren, maybe you can keep an eye on that as I present. My screen space is limited, so I don't have all the Zoom windows open. So I'd appreciate that. Okay, what's AI? There are many definitions, but I think a really good one comes from the Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's textbook from a few years back, 1995, where they define these systems as systems that perceive and act upon the external environment by taking the best possible action in a situation. Now, this isn't a this is from a computer science textbook, but it's not a particularly computer sciencey definition, right? It's a very useful plain language definition. And I'll get back to that in a moment, but I just want to run through the kinds of varieties of AI. There's artificial general intelligence, which for now is science fiction. These are systems that can perform any cognitive task as well as a human can. So you can think of science fiction characters like R2-D2, Commander Data from Star Trek, etc. We're not going to talk about this because it's far away. So really what we're talking about is specialized artificial intelligence. This is artificial intelligence systems that are good at a particular task. And there's two approaches. One, which is the older, is known as expert systems. And what you do in designing expert systems, you take some kind of knowledge base, you add an inference or logic engine to it, you ask it something, and it gives you a response. And a great example of this are chess software, right? The rules of chess are very deterministic. We know what the object of the game is, right? Capture the other player's king. And therefore, you can just sort of write a program that has the rules of chess, analyze the board in a given state of play, and then come up with the best decision, right? And this goes back to our definition, right? Perceive the board, like see what's going on, and act by taking the best possible action, right, towards checkmate for the other side. Where all the excitement is right now, though, is in machine learning, right? And I'm sure you've been talking about this in the last day. And machine learning systems are systems that, again, can learn, right? And the way they work is that there are algorithms that, and your next speaker is going to speak about this, and I read his paper, which is excellent, right? These are statistical inference engines that are able to draw statistical inferences from data. So you have these algorithms into which you feed structured or semi-structured data about the world, and then it learns to optimize some kind of function. You get a trained algorithm. The interesting thing about these systems is that they're iterative, right? So when you run one of these systems, you don't just get the output, the answer to your question, but the algorithm is going to have subtly adapted. It's going to have learned from that particular operation, right? So time and time again, it learns. So a great example of this is machine translation, right? It used to be that machine translation was based on dictionary lookups, and they were terrible, right? What now happens is, like Google Translate and other similar systems use a corpus of human translated documents. Here's the website portal of the European Union, right? Lots of documents in 26 languages or whatever it is. And they kind of learn, understand the meaning of words in their context, right? So, you could take an English word that has multiple meanings and it'll try to interpret it, right? So here is sort of the abstract of a report going through Google Translate from English into French. We had this professionally translated as well. And, Google Translate did a great job. It's pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. But the important thing is that you can learn, right? So if I want to correct it, I can go and do that by pushing this button, and then it's going to have adapted, right? Now, there's tons of these systems in lots of different fields, and we'll talk about some of them. But I think there's a question as to why we've seen this revolution in the last 10 years, right? And there are 4 basic factors, right? Is that the algorithms have gotten better. Computer processing power has become cheaper than ever, right? With the emergence of cloud computing, for example. Storage, the price of storage has crashed. So you have these enormous data sets that you can feed into these algorithms to build these inferences. And then there's also what I like to call the sensor data revolution, which is that if we go back to the definition of AI, right, systems that perceive and act upon the external environment, there's a lot more perception happening, right? So this is the little chin of a late model iPhone, right? And there are 7 different sensors on that device that are collecting data, right? And you can, replicate this in lots of different ways, right? So there's just much more data collection happening that can be analyzed and fed into these algorithmic systems. And I think autonomous vehicles are an extraordinary example of this, right? So here's some literature from Waymo, which is Google's or Alphabet's AI, autonomous vehicle division. And I think this is really interesting, right? If you can, I hope this text is legible. But it says here, our sensors and software detect and predict the behavior of not only the cyclist, in this case, the cyclist being right here, but of all the road users around us. We rely on 9 million miles of real-world experience to teach our cars to navigate safely, right? So if you think about this car, there are different sensors. There's LiDAR, there's radar, there's optical sensors, et cetera. It has all of this experience from the 9 million miles it's been driven. And basically what it's doing is millisecond by millisecond, it's sensing what's around here and trying to take the best action, right? Speed up, slow down, turn right, turn left, whatever, swerve, right? That's what the vehicle is doing in a sense, right? So I think what's important to take out of this definition is that we have systems that act upon the world in some way, right? By having data go in and having things that come out of them, whether they're direct actions like driving a car or an algorithm that's going to make some kind of prediction or decision about you. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there's any questions. That was a crash course. If there ever was one. Any questions?
Not in the chat.
Okay, so in that case, I'm going to move on to discussing what are the human rights impacts of AI now, right? There's the answer. If you looked at the report, you will have seen this crazy graphic that has on the left side these 6 use cases where AI systems of some kind are currently in use. On the right side, we have different human rights, and then we have these lines that connect them. Blue lines means the human rights impacts are positive, red means negative in general, and yellow means indeterminate. We can't really tell. And you'll see there's a lot of yellow. Okay, so I'm going to take some time unpacking what this means. right? And how we sort of came up with this assessment of these use cases. Okay, so the first question is, what do we mean by human rights? So human rights, is a term that is hard to define. There are many different definitions. Some of the definitions are descriptive, what the rights are. Some of them are normative and say, this should be a right. We should have a right to X, right? And there's a lot of debate in different fields, from political science to philosophy to ethics to law. For the purposes of this talk and our report, since we're a bunch of lawyers who wrote this, we took the view that human rights are a form of law, right? So many domestic systems enshrine human rights in different ways, but most importantly, we have an international system of human rights law. So after World War II, the UN General Assembly passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not binding per se, but we've seen the development of a vast number of human rights treaties. At the international level, we have the two big covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, right, which are the two giant framework documents. We have a bunch of sector-specific treaties, like on racial discrimination or women's equality, for example, at the international level. Then we have a bunch of regional instruments. We have the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention, the African Declaration of Human and People's Rights. So there's a lot of law out there, and that law is binding, right? So in running through this analysis, we're just taking the current status of human rights as law for granted, although there's always, discussions about what the scope of a right is, or whether or not we need new rights. So my Carr Center colleague, Sushma Raman, is the co-author of a new book arguing that digital realities requires the elaboration of new rights. We didn't get into that in this report, right? We're just taking what's there as given. So then the question is, how do we determine the human rights impacts of AI? It's a methodological question, right? But it's a consequential one, because there's this tendency, I think, to look at AI and say, oh my God, it's terrible. Look at how biased these algorithms are. And it's true, there's a lot of problems with algorithmic bias, with privacy, you name it. But it's important to remember that AI is not being introduced against a blank slate, right? We already have systems in place that produce human rights impacts on people, right? So take cars. Let's just stick with autonomous vehicles, right? People drive cars. People are not always the best drivers. People get into accidents and kill and injure each other, causing all kinds of damage, right? That's the baseline right now. So to understand the impact of autonomous vehicles on safety, right, we can't just look at when the Tesla malfunctions. We have to think about what's the difference, right? Is this system creating a better situation in aggregate? And then also, what are the distributive consequences, right? And that's our approach to analyzing the human rights impacts of AI, is that these systems are being introduced on a backdrop of human decision-making that is very imperfect, to say the least, right? And I'm going to give you a case study of the use of of algorithmic tools in the US criminal justice system to unpack these concepts, right? So for those of you who are in the US or those of you who aren't, there are huge racial disparities in criminal justice in the United States, which arguably have become worse over time. So this is a graph that shows incarceration rates in the US by race with 2 years, 1960 and 2010. So you can see from the size of the lines that the incarceration rate overall has skyrocketed in the United States. But what has happened is that racial disparities between Black and white Americans have become worse, right? In 1960, there were 5 times as many Black men in prison as white men. In 2010, it was 6.4 times, right? So if you're going to look at the impact of an algorithmic system on criminal justice, you have to take this into account, right? The whole backdrop is pretty bad. So into that, we can add an algorithmic tool. And there's a lot of controversy about this tool called Compass, which is a risk assessment algorithm that has been developed by a private company that's used for different things. So one is for sentencing, to determine how likely someone is to reoffend. Another use of the tool is to figure out, when someone's in prison, how violent are they likely to be, etc. Now, Compass is not an AI system. It's not a machine learning system. It hasn't used that approach. It's actually just a hand cranked algorithm, right? So what happened here is a bunch of statisticians, collected a bunch of criminal justice data and looked for predictors of recidivism, right? How could we tell that someone is likely to reoffend, right? So they did that. They did some studies, and then they come up with a questionnaire that gets filled out by a police officer, right, about the suspect. And then, you put the information in, and the system gives you kind of a classification. Is this person a high risk of reoffending or at a low risk of reoffending? So a few years ago, a journalistic organization in the US called ProPublica published a study that alleges that Compass exhibits racial bias. Specifically, Compass systematically overclassifies Black offenders as high risk, while underclassifying white offenders as high risk, right? So basically, it's saying that controlling for things like criminal record, right, and age. This study, according to ProPublica, shows that the system produces, it basically discriminates against Black people. It says that they're higher risk than they should be, and it says that white people are lower risk than they should be, right? To which I would say, well, I mean, that's hardly surprising, right? Because if you think about the way this algorithm was developed, and again, not machine learning, right? This is just developed by statisticians developing statistical models. How do we determine if someone is at risk of reoffending? Well, if we're going to take the baseline data on this, reflects a lot of racial bias, right? We know that communities of color in the US are over-policed, that there are certain offenses in the criminal laws that treat, offenders of color more harsh than white people. So like the disparities in the US are on crack cocaine versus regular cocaine. Crack cocaine was a much more severe offense back in the day, right? So you have over-policing, you have harsher sentences, you have juries that discriminate against people of color. So of course, a system that uses past data to predict future behavior is going to be systematically weighed against people of color, right? So you can imagine that the same problem is going to reproduce itself with an algorithmic approach, right? And there are some jurisdictions that are now trying to use machine learning to do the same kinds of risk assessment, right? So to the extent that the data used to train these systems reflects patterns of bias, and we can talk about outright discrimination, right? A racist judge versus deep-seated patterns of discrimination in society, like unequal policing, right? You're going to expect outcomes that are unfair, right? So this led us to, in our report, to try to, sort of say, okay, what's the likely human rights impact of these systems, right? And, I think we have it marked here as yellow as kind of indeterminate on some of the key rights, like freedom from discrimination. Because you could imagine a system that's actually really well programmed, right, that seeks to root out racial biases, right, and that does improve things. But on the other hand, we don't know for sure. But there's some definite problems with the very structure of these systems with regard to, for example, the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, to the extent that some kind of computer system is going to make a prediction about how risky you are, right? And that gets fed into your criminal trial. Okay, so from that, you can sort of extrapolate this spaghetti string diagram, right? Where we did this with a number of different use cases for machine learning systems that are in place. So let me briefly touch on the financial sector, right? Which I understand is, of course, what your main concern. In the United States, like many other countries, right, there are long-standing problems of racial bias in the financial sector, right? So for many decades, banks in the United States categorically refused to write mortgages to neighborhoods that were dominated by people of color, right? And that practice is known as redlining. And it still happens today, we think. So the city of Sacramento sued Wells Fargo, a major American bank, in 2018, alleging that it was discriminating against borrowers in these kinds of neighborhoods, right? We also know that conventional credit scoring systems, right, of the kind that are used to make decisions about, do you get a mortgage, do you get a credit card? In fact, they're often used for other purposes, like landlords will want to look at your credit file before renting you an apartment. Your cable or television company or phone company may ask for your credit score before giving you service. That these systems, again, which initially are just the product of multivariate statistical analysis, but now increasingly involve some flavors of machine learning, can encode racial bias and racial disparities, right? And some of it is background because people of color just have worse outcomes than white people in the United States, for example. But there can be other sort of subtle things in the way that the systems are designed, right? But on the positive end, right, there are clearly uses of algorithmic technologies that are aiming to be ameliorative. So there's a company called Zest Finance. I think they've now renamed themselves as Zest AI. And their mission is to basically try to use machine learning to identify good credit risks in populations that have been traditionally excluded from the financial system, right? So there's a problem in what's known as like the thin file, right? Which is that if you've lacked access to the financial system because you're poor and you don't have a lot of history of using credit because you haven't been able to obtain it, it's hard for lenders to make a decision about you. So what they're trying to do is gather alternative data points that would try to show how good of a credit risk use applications with regard to populations that are underserved in a wealthy country like the US or Canada or Great Britain, but also in developing countries, right, where lenders, again, do not have the same kinds of credit scoring systems aren't established, right? So you could imagine using these systems to identify people who are good credit risks and extend that. Or you could think about applications of these systems to detect bias in existing patterns of lending, right? So there are ameliorative possibilities too, which is reflected in our analysis of automated credit scoring technologies in our report, right? That although there are some aspects that are indeterminate, it's very likely that these could have a positive impact with regard to some human rights, while at the same time having negative impacts on others. Like you could imagine how if all of your data were being used to make financial decisions about you, you might refrain from certain kinds of activity because out of fear that an adverse inference will be made against you. So for example, you could imagine an algorithmic system that says, people that tend to go to this kind of restaurant tend to engage in high risk behaviors because they eat risky kinds of foods. Therefore, I won't do it. That's an extreme example, but you get the kind of risk that it can be chilling in some way of your freedom to act in society when you know that all of this information about you could be used against you in some way, right? Might be for your benefit, might not be, right? So there's like this general problem of chilling effects with these technologies. I'm going to stop there before going to the next set of slides to see if there's any questions on that material.
There were quite a few actually.
Okay. So let's go through them. Hang on, I've lost my window here. So maybe, Soren, could I have you call on folks maybe and just moderate the discussion?
Yeah. Jennifer, you have a question. Are you ready to unmute yourself and ask it here?
Yeah, sure, Soren. Thank you. So my question is with regard to there are obviously great gains that AI has put in place or brought about, but there are also quite a few negative effects. And I'm looking at a few, namely, we see infringement on the right to privacy, right to equality, freedom of expression, infringement of intellectual property rights. Are there any human rights structures that come to mind in terms of dealing with these negative effects, or is there something in the making to sort of alleviate these issues, which are quite pertinent with regard to human rights, especially?
So I'm going to touch on, that's basically the focus of the next part of the presentation, about what can be done to alleviate the negative effects and improve the positive. But I just want to give you the descriptive picture as it stood. And you'll see, like, there are some, you know, so on some, you'll see that we almost always in the report find a negative impact on privacy. And part of the issue there is that these systems are premised on the collection and analysis of vast quantities of private data, right? You just can't get around that. If you're going to make decisions about human beings and apply these to, again, not predicting the weather or the behavior of elephants, but to predicting, you know, things about people, you can't get around the fact that you're going to use data about people, right? And that always involves some impact on the right to privacy. Now, it might be worth the cost, if you will, because of the ameliorative effects in other areas, but that's something we almost always see as a kind of cost. Okay.
And Katarina, you had a question. I can't really, it's on page 40. I can't really see what specifically, assuming the likelihoods on page 40. Do you wish to elaborate?
Yes, so my question was because as far as I remember now, it was about the likelihood of how AI will impact certain groups. And I just wanted to ask you what your assumptions were based upon. Yes, because I thought that maybe in the course of our seminar here or course that we would have to do something similar. Yeah, so I just like to know from you as an expert, yeah, how you would assume likelihoods of a technology like AI.
That's a great question. Now, I can't remember what example we're discussing on page 40 of the report, but the general answer is that there isn't really a good way of doing it, right? And this is a challenge that all practitioners of what's known as, you know, human rights impact assessment face, right? Is that we have relatively poor methodological tools, and we have to kind of rely on our logic, inference, and reasoning to make those assessments at this time, right? You could imagine ways that you can collect data, you know, once something is in the wild about the effects, but, you know, it really is mostly a thought exercise that relies on judgment and experience in terms of thinking through whether the impacts, or, you know, for some of them, we've seen them, right, in the field, because some systems have been deployed and we can actually, you know, quantify or evaluate what the impacts are. But that's a very tough methodological problem that you have pointed out.
And I'm just looking through the chats. Rosemary, you had a question earlier on AI in connection to big data and judiciary.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Can you hear me? I have a question. Yes.
Yes, Rosemary, go ahead.
Yes. I was wondering, the big data phenomenon, how does it in line with human rights? Because big data require data mining, data collection, and data analysis. How does that human rights framework also are in line with it? But also, on the other hand, you showed us the kind of data classification of criminal judiciary, what do you call it? Criminal justice of the USA from 1960 to 2010. How did human rights framework used in digitization of that data?
So, okay, there's a few different questions to unpack there, right? One is, okay, so just like what's big data, right? And I think big data is is part of this cluster of terms that's used to describe algorithmic technologies, right? Technologies that basically collect vast amounts of data about people and then use various analytical techniques to either identify patterns in the data, draw inferences from the data, et cetera, right? So I think we're talking about kind of the same family of technologies here. Criminal justice is very interesting because data collection is actually very poor in criminal justice, unlike many other fields. Even in countries with very advanced rule of law, we have a very poor understanding from a quantitative perspective of what's happening in the courts, right? How many crimes are committed in a country? Who's convicted, et cetera. All this data is pretty hard. What's the distribution of sentences? A lot of data has not been collected. And in fact, one of the positive trends with the move towards automation and the use of AI is that data collection in a lot of these areas has improved a lot, which does permit analysis to look at patterns, right? And who's being treated in what way. But I think the issue with a lot of these systems is around both the, how are they designed, how are they used, but also what are they optimizing for, right? Because ultimately these systems are designed to do something, to make a certain kind of decision, right? So take Compass, for example, right? Compass reflects a theory in the United States, in its justice system, that the likelihood of reoffending has something to do with how long someone should be imprisoned, right? There's an idea baked into it that part of the idea of throwing someone in jail is to stop them from committing crimes for the length of their imprisonment, right? And that's a questionable assumption, right? Other criminal justice systems are not based on the idea of that kind of incapacitation in that form, right? So again, the design of the systems themselves, right, have social consequences regardless of how, what they're optimizing for, right, and what data is fed into them, right? So that's like another sort of, it's like a different order of issues. I like to give this example to make it more concrete. So imagine applying a system like Compass to the activities of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., right? Who, of course, engaged in a campaign of organized civil disobedience to, undercut segregation in the United States. So you can imagine Martin Luther King going into Compass, right? And what do you think the algorithm would say? Here's a guy who is 100% likely to reoffend. Of course, he's going to, commit civil disorder again. Of course, he's going to block the roads and, all this stuff, right? His past experience, his past history suggests he is definitely going to do it again, right? So if we have systems that are going to automate, blindly sort of sentence people to jail based on that kind of an assessment, there's like important questions about, what is our theory of change in society, and how does someone like King get up in front of a judge and say this whole system is unfair, right? The law is unfair, right? But that's kind of an example of what I'm trying to get at here, is that these systems, once developed, kind of bake in certain kinds of values and norms, regardless of kinds of the fine debates we're having about how good is the data being fed into them, right? So like the decisions that they're entrusted to make reflect certain power relations in society. More questions?
We had there's one, Catherine, yours is actually perhaps even for Mark, when the data contains biases, how to correct for that. Unless you want to venture into that, Vivek?
I'll leave that to Mark from a computer science perspective to answer. There are lots of techniques that can be used, right?
And Martin, you have a question, I think very relevant, on whether digital trade agreements between developing and developed countries have data ownership as a human right in favor of citizens from the former. Do you wish to elaborate, Martin?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Soren. Vivek, an interesting presentation and also an interesting paper. Making it practical, primarily from the perspective of rights, Kenya is negotiating a free trade agreement with the US. Japan and the US signed off on a digital trade agreement over and above a free trade agreement.
Yes.
There's this question of ownership of data, and in a digital economy, AI plays a big role. From your perspective, or in your opinion, particularly on the perspective of human rights, at a minimum, should citizens in developing countries own their data, and should that be mandated in such treaties that governments at a minimum should always rule in favor of developing country citizens, even though it's infringing on what would be considered rights of the companies, multinationals? Any opinion on that?
That is a really, really hard question. The question of data ownership is difficult. And I teach a class on privacy law where we sort of discuss these kinds of issues. Because the problem with the data is that it's about you, right? It's information about you, but other people have certain kinds of rights to it, right? So for example, I have certain information about you by virtue of us having communicated, right? I now know your name, which is a piece of personally identifiable data. So what does it mean to say that you have an ownership right over it, right? You can't make me forget that because I know it now. I can record it, and I need it for certain purposes, right? So I think a categorical approach to ownership or not is not quite the right way to look at it, which is why data protection law, for example, the GDPR, gives people who are data subjects certain rights over data, but it's not ownership in the way that you own your car or your house, or your phone, right? It's not quite the same. It's not the quite same kind of proprietary interest, right? Canada and Mexico and the US also negotiated a similar agreement to the US-Japan one not so long ago, which I don't think addresses data ownership questions at all. It's more about market access, as far as I know. So I would take some small comfort in that. It probably doesn't foreclose the possibility of Kenya enacting strong data protection law, right, and enforcing that on US-based multinationals. Okay, mindful of the time, I'm just going to run through the last section of my presentation, and then maybe we can gather questions at the end, right? Which is, what should businesses do about the human rights impacts of AI, right? And I focus this on businesses because the private sector is driving the development of AI, right? Therefore, the private sector has a huge role to play in ensuring that these technologies are used for good, right? AI systems that are used by governments also are basically designed by the private sector, right? So this brings us to the importance of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are also known as the Ruggie Principles after their author, John Ruggie, who is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. For those of you who are not familiar with the Guiding Principles, you can boil it down very quickly to this three-pronged approach, right? Three-pillared approach of protect, respect, and remedy. Now, under international law, governments have the legal responsibility to protect human rights from infringement. This goes to Martin's question about data protection, amongst other things. But everyone, and especially companies, have a responsibility to respect human rights. And governments and companies both have responsibilities to provide remedies when there are human rights violations. Now, the guiding principles, we could talk about them for days if we wanted to and get into the details. But the main way that companies embody and demonstrate respect for human rights is by conducting human rights due diligence, right? Which is think about what are the likely human rights impacts of the business before you undertake a course of activity. And this goes to the earlier question about how do you tell, right? Now, it's easy in some contexts, right? If you are going to build a mine in a country where there is a highly repressive government that is known to use its military to, beat up indigenous peoples, et cetera, you have a pretty clear sense of what might happen, right? It's much harder in the digital realm to conduct this kind of due diligence, right? Although there's a lot of work being done to do that. Part of that work involves developing principles, right? Which is to say, here as a company, here's what we will do and won't do. So a lot of leading technology companies have articulated AI principles as a governance tool. And companies, including Google, Microsoft, and others, have conducted detailed human rights impact assessments with regard to algorithmic technologies and have made certain kinds of calls, like they will not support development of weapons technology. After the Black Lives Matter protests this summer in the United States, a lot of companies have decided that they will not, that they'll exit the facial recognition market, for example, right? So that all goes to the due diligence question, right? But then there's also the question of remedy, right? So something bad happens, what do you do about it? I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I wanted to talk to you just about a couple of little things that are already being done, right, to combat machine bias. So here's a small example. If you use Google products like Gmail, you'll notice that there's this autocomplete feature, right? As you start typing a sentence, it tries to complete it. So Google discovered when they were programming these systems that there was a lot of gender bias that had crept into the system, right? And here's an example, right? Again, if we go back to think about machine learning as a system for again, these are basically tools of statistical inference, as Mark will talk about, I'm sure, in the next hour, right? Google's engineers discovered that, if you ask the system to come up with some of these, I'm forgetting the logical term here. Man is to woman as king as to what? It would say queen. Man is to woman as computer programmers to what? Syllogisms, that's the word. It would come up with an answer like homemaker, right? And this is a reflection of human reality, right? It's a reflection of how people have historically used words that then gets programmed into a Google feature, right? So Google went and scrubbed those out, which is great. There are startups that try to take this approach to improving rights outcomes. So there's a human resources company called Entero that basically uses machine learning to analyze resumes, right? So companies can decide, they get a large volume of applications, can decide who to interview. And part of what they do, one of their features, is that they go through the information submitted by a candidate and take out gender identifiers, racial identifiers, things that identify social class, et cetera, to try to improve outcomes, right? So here are a couple of examples of ameliorative uses of these technologies, right? But just to wrap up quickly, there's a large literature that examines what can private actors do about human rights. So Rick Locke, who is now the provost of Brown, wrote this great book about human rights and supply chains, right? So, basically issues with companies like Nike outsourcing production to the developing world, right? And he shows that corporate programs can have a very significant impact, but they work best in places where there's a strong regulatory framework, or at least governments are on side with that kind of mission, right? So, I think there's a certain amount of things that companies can do, but there's a certain amount of things that governments need to do too. I'm going to leave you with a couple of parting thoughts for where we need governments to intervene. And one relates to what's known as the trolley problem in ethics, right? And this is the idea that there's a runaway trolley, you're standing by this switch, and you have a choice. If you do nothing, it's going to kill 6 people. If you pull the switches, it's going to kill 1 person. What do you choose, right? And there's all kinds of varieties of this problem. And it turns out that there are, major cultural differences in how people respond to this problem. So some researchers at MIT asked people in several dozen countries, there's a runaway driverless car. Should it kill grandma or should it kill a baby, right? And very interesting patterns arose, which is that the United States is the most pro-baby country in the world. People here would say, people in the US say, kill grandma. She's lived a long time, right? When you go to East Asia, people are extraordinarily pro-grandma. They say, we revere elders, and the baby is replaceable. We can just go make a new one. So it seems to be the logic that is animating that. And interestingly, the country that's at the tipping point is Finland. Finland has an equal number of pro-baby and pro-grandma people in the survey response. But this is a question that human rights can't answer, because human rights assumes that all people are equal. So you can't get a human rights answer as to should the autonomous vehicle prefer grandma or the baby, right? That's an ethical problem that I would say has to be solved in a democracy, right, through democratic deliberation. Now, I'm told by people who work on autonomous vehicles that they actually designed these things to stop, right, not to make that choice. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment as to how, like, a point where you need governments where the human rights framework breaks down, and you need democratic decision making. Another example is what I call absolute versus relative effects, right? So to go back to the criminal justice example, right? We know that racial disparities in the US have gotten worse. So do this thought experiment. And I'd be curious if we could just use the show of hands function, right? So we know that there's currently 6.4 times more Black people in jail in the US than the US, and than white people. Now imagine that we have some amazing algorithmic system that's able to reduce the incarceration rate in half, except it reduces it by 50.1% for white people and 49.9% for Black people, right? Everyone is absolutely better off, right? There are now half as many people overall in jail, but we've made the racial disparity worse, right? With that small difference in in the effect, right, the racial disparity goes up. Is that a system we should accept or not, right? Again, it's hard to come up with a human rights answer to that question. I think it's very hard for businesses to answer that question, right? I think that's the sort of question that governments are going to need to answer, right? That we as a society need to deliberate on, right? So, it's two sort of parting questions that you can think about is, like, what are kinds of the limits of a human rights analysis to set the novel ethical challenges that AI poses? And then, there's an interesting set of questions about what the appropriate role is of business in addressing these challenges. Okay, I've left it with 3 minutes for questions, but I'm happy to respond to things by email as well. So let's have a discussion.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes. Quick questions. There's a lot of food for thought. We're about to launch a process, Vivek, and you've seen sort of our basic paper on this, and we'll look sort of exactly on the kinds of questions that you've raised, human rights and ethical and other challenges. We call them ethical dilemmas, but in essence, it's a risk scan, very much lending from the work that you undertook, and very inspired by that work, relating to the financial sector, sort of identifying where are the real challenges. And I can see while I've been speaking, Jennifer raises one question. Do you want to put that forward, Jennifer?
I see it, Jennifer.
Yeah,
now
sure.
I'm on chat. I can. The answer is yes. I mean, I think there's a role for more awareness, for more research, for more policy, for more engagement by governments of all stripes. Right. And I think what's interesting about this technology, unlike most others that we're dealing with, is that we are actually having very serious human rights conversations and ethical conversations at an early stage in the life of the technology. Like, no one ever did this with regard to the automobile or the development of airplanes or anything like that, right? So I take that as a positive step. What am I working on now in the AI area? I'm really interested in AI and discrimination. And what I'm discovering is that the current law of discrimination in a lot of countries is just not designed to deal with algorithmic discrimination, right? The elements of proof that you have to advance to make a discrimination claim in Canada or the United States are really hard to demonstrate when some kind of statistical system classifies you in a particular way, right? So if we're going to preserve the right to non-discrimination, that's something that I've been working on.
Would that be would that be the biggest? So I was about to ask you, what is the biggest challenge that you see for the financial sector? You went through the financial sector and you made your spaghetti diagram for the financial sector, and so what would be what do you see as possibly the most challenging, or some of the most challenging questions that
well, I think what's really interesting about the financial sector is in most countries very heavily regulated, right? And I've spoken to some people at banks in a number of countries, right, that would like, so I mean, for example, banks use these kinds of systems for fraud detection purposes quite extensively, because there are relatively few rules around fraud detection, right? But when it comes to the core of their business and like their lending business and consumer decision making, right, there's a lot of concern about how existing banking regulation interacts with this stuff, right? So in some ways, I mean, even though I think there's enormous ameliorative potential, the risk aversion of the financial sector may be leading us to, may actually be kind of retarding the change that we need or slowing it down beyond a level that's useful. So I think, you know, it'd be interesting to think about what regulatory structures you can create. And part of it is also, you know, technology design. You know, there are these people talk about human in the loop systems versus human on the loop systems, basically talking about what's the role, what's the design of the algorithmic system and how do humans interact with it, right? Is it the decision of the system is final? Is it an input into a human decision maker? So like, what's the structure and what is it ultimately deciding, right? So I think there are ways in the financial sector to calibrate this. It would be interesting to see if the Thun group of banks, which is a group of banks that's been working on implementing the UN guiding principles in the financial sector, I think there's 6 or 7 banks in it, take on this particular set of topics. I don't think that they have so far, but it might be a good idea if they did. Okay, I'm afraid I need to leave to my next engagement, but yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoy speaking with you, and I'm happy to continue the conversations online.
Thank you, Vivek. Really, really wonderful, and a perfect launch to kick off to our projects. I hope we can disturb you later down the road on that. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.
So